the polarization of that third rail with regard to cultural war issues like gay marriage, like marijuana, are flipping very rapidly now. But what's kept it locked in place for so long is that the solutions to these problems are very often counterintuitive. If drugs are bad, why not have a war on drugs, right? The way I explain it, one of my favorite popular philosophers, you've probably heard of him, last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew. Young Bart Simpson runs for class president in an episode of The Simpsons, and he begins his campaign by attacking his opponent. He says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough." That's the problem with Washington. That's the problem with politics today. That people want easy answers. It plays well on things like Fox News, that it's an easy soundbite. And it's counterintuitive to explain why being tough is not the same as being effective. That you cannot regulate that which you deliberately drive underground and give that market over to criminals. They are the ones who self-regulate. And so it's counterintuitive. What do I mean by counterintuitive? This is a prop I use when I talk to legislatures. Right? This is an example of a counterintuitive problem solving. You've probably played with these when you were kids, and if you get stuck in one, you know, the intuitive solution, the knee-jerk solution, the one that sells on Fox News, is the pull. But the harder you pull, the stucker you get. Right? It's counterintuitive to think that maybe relaxing a bit, maybe pushing in just a little bit, that's the way you extract yourself from a difficult problem. And so the war on drugs is one of those things that has counterintuitive solutions. And so what do we do about this? I mean, so if you do support what's happening in Colorado, in Washington State, in Washington, D.C., and these other states, how do we operationalize? How do we, think tanks will tell you about the natures of problems, et cetera, but how do you actually solve these? How do you operationalize this so that we can get more reform in other states that are trying to do the similar things? And I think one of the ways to do that, again, it's very counterintuitive, is that there's too much accountability for politicians. And before you freak out and think I'm crazy, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Oscar Wilde once said, if you want someone to tell you the truth, give them a mask. Right? If you all were the U.S. Congress, say 10 years ago, and I asked for a show of hands, how many of you believe that we should regulate and tax marijuana much like alcohol, that it's time we did this? Probably very few of you would raise your hands. Maybe you could count on one hand the number of representatives that would do that. If you did that today, however, maybe a few more hands would come up. Maybe you take 2 or 3 hands to count the number. But what if I said, put your heads down on your table, like in grade school, and then raise your hand if you believe this, if you support this? Completely different result. A vastly different result. And I think that's the way, if you give politicians a temporary veil of anonymity, to have a non-binding straw poll. I don't believe law should be made in secret. Right? There needs to be accountability in the end. But as an icebreaker, you can do this in your churches, in your labor unions, in your association meetings, or whatever. Have an anonymous straw poll. And because when you find out that a lot of the people in the room actually agree with you, it changes the nature of the conversation. It jumpstarts that conversation. And so if you were able to do a survey in Congress today, and it turned out that, say 2/3 wanted to tax and regulate cannabis, that if you release the aggregate number, the result of that, no names attached, right? Just that in aggregate, 2/3 of Congress actually believes this, then that gives some political cover for politicians to stand up and do the right thing, the courageous thing. They can say, look, I'm actually being courageous by saying publicly what my colleagues all believe privately, that it's time we begin to change our policies on this issue. And I think that's a way to solve a lot of third rail issues in Washington. And we're running out of time, both me and Congress are running out of time to deal with very serious issues. Things like climate change, things like sensible gun control, or other issues that are controversial that politicians cannot deal with. They're paralyzed because they're pinned down by these gotcha votes. And I'll just finish with this. It started, I think, in 1973 when the House of Representatives instituted electronic voting. It made the process a lot easier. You can push a button and register your vote. Who could possibly be against that? But again, the law of unintended consequences. It became easier to get recorded votes, and gradually the number of recorded votes started rising. Before this, they didn't go through a roll call vote every time there was a vote. They did voice votes, they did teller votes, they would sometimes count heads and count parties, but not names. And in that kind of a climate, we could have much more practical politics. People can cross over the party line and say, you know, my party, you know, really wants to support these interests in these polluters or whatever, but I have children, I have grandchildren, I care about what kind of world they're going to inherit. I'm going to cross party lines and vote in favor of this legislation against my party's wishes. And if you give this temporary veil of conscience, V-E-I-L, not veil, but a veil of conscience to politicians, it lets them express for the first time their honest feelings, their true feelings about what they really believe is the best interest of the nation as a whole rather than the political party. Why should we be against more honesty in politics? Again, they're going to have a formal vote on this, but you can have an icebreaker that begins to take the sting out of the third rail and the gotcha politics that we're trapped in today. Because right now, Washington is fundamentally broken. They can't do anything. I mean, it's never been this bad. And I've lived in Washington since 1987, and I grew up in the suburbs. So with that, I wish you luck, and I want to thank the voters of Colorado for getting the ball rolling.
So we have learned that Sanho is a Christmas baby based on